Chapter 14. Certainly Nancy had gone with them, since Minta Doyle had asked it with her dumb look, holding out her hand, as Nancy made off after lunch to her attic to escape the horror of family life. She supposed she must go then. She did not want to go. She did not want to be drawn into it all. For, as they walked along the road to the cliff, Minta kept on taking her hand. Then she would let it go. Then she would take it again. What was it she wanted? Nancy asked herself. There was something, of course, that people wanted. For when Minta took her hand and held it, Nancy, reluctantly, saw the whole world spread out beneath her, as if it were Constantinople seen through a mist, and then, however heavy-eyed one might be, one must needs ask, is that Santa Sophia? Is that the Golden Horn? So Nancy asked when Minta took her hand, what is it that she wants? Is it that? And what was that? Here and there emerged from the mist, as Nancy looked down upon life spread beneath her, a pinnacle, a dome, prominent things without names. But when Minta dropped her hand, as she did when they ran down the hillside, all that, the dome, the pinnacle, whatever it was that had protruded through the mist, sank down into it and disappeared. Minta, Andrew observed, was rather a good walker. She wore more sensible clothes than most women. She wore very short skirts and black knickerbockers. She would jump straight into a stream and flounder across. He liked her rashness, but he saw that it would not do. She would kill herself in some idiotic way one of these days. She seemed to be afraid of nothing, except bulls. At the mere sight of a bull in a field, she would throw up her arms and fly screaming, which was the very thing to enrage a bull, of course. But she did not mind owning up to it in the least, one must admit that. She knew she was an awful coward about bulls, she said. She thought she must have been tossed in her perambulator when she was a baby. She didn't seem to mind what she said or did. Suddenly now she pitched down on the edge of the cliff and began to sing some song about "Damn your eyes, damn your eyes." They all had to join in and sing the chorus and shout out together, "Damn your eyes, damn your eyes." But it would be fatal to let the tide come in and cover up all the good hunting grounds before they got onto the beach. Fatal, Paul agreed, springing up, and as they went slithering down, he kept quoting the guide-book about these islands being justly celebrated for their park-like prospects and the extent and variety of their marine curiosities. But it would not do altogether, this shouting and damning your eyes, Andrew felt, picking his way down the cliff, this clapping him on the back and calling him "old fellow," and all that. It would not altogether do. It was the worst of taking women on walks. Once on the beach they separated, he going out onto the Pope's Nose, taking his shoes off and rolling his socks in them, and letting that couple look after themselves. Nancy waded out to her own rocks and searched her own pools, and let that couple look after themselves. She crouched low down and touched the smooth rubber-like sea anemones who were stuck like lumps of jelly to the side of the rock. Brooding, she changed the pool into the sea, and made the minnows into sharks and whales, and cast vast clouds over this tiny world by holding her hand against the sun, and so brought darkness and desolation, like God himself, to millions of ignorant and innocent creatures, and then took her hand away suddenly and let the sun stream down. Out on the pale criss-crossed sand, high-stepping, fringed, gauntleted, stalked some fantastic leviathan. She was still enlarging the pool, and slipped into the vast fissures of the mountain-side. And then, letting her eyes slide imperceptibly above the pool and rest on that wavering line of sea and sky, on the tree trunks which the smoke of steamers made waver on the horizon, she became with all that power sweeping savagely in and inevitably withdrawing, hypnotized, and the two senses of that vastness and this tininess, the pool had diminished again, flowering within it, made her feel that she was bound hand and foot, and unable to move by the intensity of feelings which reduced her own body, her own life, and the lives of all the people in the world, for ever, to nothingness. So, listening to the waves, crouching over the pool, she brooded. And Andrew shouted that the sea was coming in, so she leapt splashing through the shallow waves onto the shore, and ran up the beach, and was carried by her own impetuosity and her desire for rapid movement right behind a rock, and there, oh heavens, in each other's arms, were Paul and Minta kissing, probably. She was outraged, indignant. She and Andrew put on their shoes and stockings in dead silence, without saying a thing about it. Indeed, they were rather sharp with each other. She might have called him when she saw the crayfish or whatever it was, Andrew grumbled. However, they both felt, it's not our fault. They had not wanted this horrid nuisance to happen. All the same, it irritated Andrew that Nancy should be a woman, and Nancy that Andrew should be a man, and they tied their shoes very neatly and drew the bows rather tight. It was not until they had climbed right up onto the top of the cliff again that Minta cried out that she had lost her grandmother's brooch. Her grandmother's brooch, the sole ornament she possessed. A weeping willow. It was, they must remember it, set in pearls. They must have seen it, she said, with the tears running down her cheeks, the brooch which her grandmother had fastened her cap with till the last day of her life. Now she had lost it. She would rather have lost anything than that. She would go back and look for it. They all went back. They poked and peered and looked. They kept their heads very low and said things shortly and gruffly. Paul Rayleigh searched like a madman all about the rock where they had been sitting. All this pother about a brooch really didn't do at all, Andrew thought, as Paul told him to make a thorough search between this point and that. The tide was coming in fast. The sea would cover the place where they had sat in a minute. There was not a ghost of a chance of their finding it now. "We shall be cut off!" Minta shrieked, suddenly terrified. As if there were any danger of that. It was the same as the bulls all over again. She had no control over her emotions, Andrew thought. Women hadn't. The wretched Paul had to pacify her. The men, Andrew and Paul at once became manly and different from usual, took counsel briefly, and decided that they would plant Rayleigh's stick where they had sat, and come back at low tide again. There was nothing more that could be done now. If the brooch was there, it would still be there in the morning, they assured her, but Minta still sobbed, all the way up to the top of the cliff. It was her grandmother's brooch. She would rather have lost anything but that. And yet Nancy felt it might be true that she minded losing her brooch, but she wasn't crying only for that. She was crying for something else. We might all sit down and cry, she felt, but she did not know what for. They drew ahead together, Paul and Minta, and he comforted her and said how famous he was for finding things. Once, when he was a little boy, he had found a gold watch. He would get up at daybreak, and he was positive he would find it. It seemed to him that it would be almost dark, and he would be alone on the beach, and somehow it would be rather dangerous. He began telling her, however, that he would certainly find it, and she said that she would not hear of his getting up at dawn. It was lost. She knew that. She had had a presentiment when she put it on that afternoon. And secretly he resolved that he would not tell her, but he would slip out of the house at dawn when they were all asleep, and if he could not find it, he would go to Edinburgh and buy her another, just like it but more beautiful. He would prove what he could do. And as they came out on the hill and saw the lights of the town beneath them, the lights coming out suddenly one by one seemed like things that were going to happen to him, his marriage, his children, his house. And again he thought, as they came out onto the high road, which was shaded with high bushes, how they would retreat into solitude together, and walk on, he always leading her, and she pressing close to his side, as she did now. As they turned by the crossroads, He thought what an appalling experience he had been through, and he must tell someone. Mrs. Ramsay, of course, for it took his breath away to think what he had been and done. It had been far and away the worst moment of his life when he asked Minta to marry him. He would go straight to Mrs. Ramsay, because he felt somehow that she was the person who had made him do it. She had made him think he could do anything. Nobody else took him seriously. But she made him believe that he could do whatever he wanted. He had felt her eyes on him all day today, following him about, though she never said a word, as if she were saying, "Yes, you can do it. I believe in you. I expect it of you." She had made him feel all that, and directly they got back, he looked for the lights of the house above the bay. He would go to her and say, "I've done it, Mrs. Ramsay, thanks to you." And so, turning into the lane that led to the house, he could see lights moving about in the upper windows. They must be awfully late then. People were getting ready for dinner. The house was all lit up, and the lights after the darkness made his eyes feel full, and he said to himself, childishly, as he walked up the drive, "Lights, lights, lights," and repeated in a dazed way, "Lights, lights, lights," as they came into the house, staring about him with his face quite stiff. But, good heavens, he said to himself, putting his hand to his tie, I must not make a fool of myself. Chapter 15. "Yes," said Prue in her considering way, answering her mother's question. "I think Nancy did go with them." Chapter 16. Well then, Nancy had gone with them, Mrs. Ramsay supposed, wondering, as she put down a brush, took up a comb, and said, "Come in," to a tap at the door. Jasper and Rose came in. Whether the fact that Nancy was with them made it less likely or more likely that anything would happen. It made it less likely somehow, Mrs. Ramsay thought, very irrationally, except that after all holocaust on such a scale was not probable. They could not all be drowned. And again she felt alone in the presence of her old antagonist, life. Jasper and Rose said that Mildred wanted to know whether she should wait dinner. "Not for the Queen of England," said Mrs. Ramsay emphatically. "Not for the Empress of Mexico," she added, laughing at Jasper, for he shared his mother's vice. He too exaggerated. And if Rose liked, she said, while Jasper took the message, she might choose which jewels she was to wear. When there are 15 people sitting down to dinner, one cannot keep things waiting forever. She was now beginning to feel annoyed with them for being so late. It was inconsiderate of them, and it annoyed her on top of her anxiety about them, that they should choose this very night to be out late, when in fact she wished the dinner to be particularly nice, since William Banks had at last consented to dine with them, and they were having Mildred's masterpiece, boeuf en daube. Everything depended upon things being served up to the precise moment they were ready. The beef, the bay-leaf, and the wine all must be done to a turn. To keep it waiting was out of the question. Yet of course tonight, of all nights, out they went, and they came in late, and things had to be sent out, things had to be kept hot. The boeuf en daube would be entirely spoilt. Jasper offered her an opal necklace, Rose a gold necklace. Which looked best against her black dress? Which did indeed, said Mrs. Ramsay absent-mindedly, looking at her neck and shoulders, but avoiding her face, in the glass. And then, while the children rummaged among her things, she looked out of the window at a sight which always amused her, the rooks trying to decide which tree to settle on. Every time they seemed to change their minds and rose up into the air again, because, she thought, the old rook, the father rook, old Joseph was her name for him, was a bird of a very trying and difficult disposition. He was a disreputable old bird, with half his wing feathers missing. He was like some seedy old gentleman in a top hat she had seen playing the horn in front of a public house. "Look," she said, laughing. They were actually fighting. Joseph and Mary were fighting. Anyhow, they all went up again, and the air was shoved aside by their black wings and cut into exquisite scimitar shapes. The movements of the wings beating out, 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 she could never describe it accurately enough to please herself, was one of the loveliest of all to her. "Look at that," she said to Rose, hoping that Rose would see it more clearly than she could. For one's children so often gave one's own perceptions a little thrust forwards. But which was it to be? They had all the trays of her jewel case open. The gold necklace, which was Italian, or the opal necklace, which Uncle James had brought her from India, or should she wear her amethysts? "Choose, dearests, choose," she said, hoping that they would make haste. But she let them take their time to choose. She let Rose, particularly, take up this and then that, and hold her jewels against the black dress, for this little ceremony of choosing jewels, which was gone through every night, was what Rose liked best, she knew. She had some hidden reason of her own for attaching great importance to this choosing what her mother was to wear. What was the reason, Mrs. Ramsay wondered, standing still to let her clasp the necklace she had chosen, divining, through her own past, some deep, some buried, some quite speechless feeling that one had for one's mother at Rose's age. Like all feelings felt for oneself, Mrs. Ramsay thought, it made one sad. It was so inadequate what one could give in return, and what Rose felt was quite out of proportion to anything she actually was. And Rose would grow up, and Rose would suffer, she supposed, with these deep feelings, and she said she was ready now, and they would go down, and Jasper, because he was the gentleman, should give her his arm, and Rose, as she was the lady, should carry her handkerchief. She gave her the handkerchief. And what else? Oh yes, it might be cold, a shawl. Choose me a shawl, she said, for that would please Rose, who was bound to suffer so. "There," she said, stopping by the window on the landing. "There they are again." Joseph had settled on another tree-top. "Don't you think they mind," she said to Jasper, "having their wings broken?" Why did he want to shoot poor old Joseph and Mary? He shuffled a little on the stairs and felt rebuked, but not seriously, for she did not understand the fun of shooting birds. And they did not feel, and being his mother she lived away in another division of the world, but he rather liked her stories about Mary and Joseph. She made him laugh. But how did she know that those were Mary and Joseph? Did she think the same birds came to the same trees every night, he asked. But here, suddenly, like all grown-up people, she ceased to pay him the least attention. She was listening to a clatter in the hall. "They've come back!" she exclaimed, and at once she felt much more annoyed with them than relieved. Then she wondered, had it happened? She would go down and they would tell her. But no, they could not tell her anything with all these people about. So she must go down and begin dinner and wait. And, like some queen who, finding her people gathered in the hall, looks down upon them and descends among them, and acknowledges their tributes silently, and accepts their devotion and their prostration before her, Paul did not move a muscle but looked straight before him as she passed. She went down and crossed the hall, and bowed her head very slightly, as if she accepted what they could not say, their tribute to her beauty. But she stopped. There was a smell of burning. Could they have let the boeuf en daube overboil, she wondered, pray heaven not, when the great clangour of the gong announced solemnly, authoritatively, that all those scattered about, in attics, in bedrooms, on little perches of their own, reading, writing, putting the last smooth to their hair, or fastening dresses, must leave all that, and the little odds and ends on their washing-tables and dressing-tables, and the novels on the bed-tables, and the diaries which were so private, and assemble in the dining-room for dinner. Chapter 17. "But what have I done with my life?" thought Mrs. Ramsay, taking her place at the head of the table, and looking at all the plates making white circles on it. "William, sit by me," she said. "Lily," she said wearily, "over there." They had that, Paul Rayleigh and Minter Doyle, She, only this, an infinitely long table and plates and knives. At the far end was her husband, sitting down, all in a heap, frowning. What at? She did not know. She did not mind. She could not understand how she had ever felt any emotion or affection for him. She had a sense of being past everything, through everything, out of everything, as she helped the soup, as if there was an eddy, there, and one could be in it or one could be out of it, and she was out of it. It's all come to an end, she thought, while they came in one after another. Charles Tansley. Sit there, please, she said. Augustus Carmichael, and sat down. And meanwhile she waited, passively, for someone to answer her, for something to happen. But this is not a thing, she thought, ladling out soup, that one says. Raising her eyebrows at the discrepancy, that was what she was thinking, this was what she was doing, ladling out soup. She felt, more and more strongly, outside that eddy, or as if a shade had fallen and robbed of colour, she saw things truly. The room, she looked round it, was very shabby. There was no beauty anywhere. She forbore to look at Mr. Tansley. Nothing seemed to have merged. They all sat separate. And the whole effort of merging and flowing and creating rested on her. Again she felt, as a fact without hostility, the sterility of men, for if she did not do it, nobody would do it. And so, giving herself a little shake that one gives a watch that has stopped, the old familiar pulse began beating, as the watch begins ticking. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And so on, she repeated, listening to it, sheltering and fostering the still feeble pulse as one might guard a weak flame with a newspaper. And so then, she concluded, addressing herself by bending silently in his direction to William Banks, poor man, who had no wife and no children, and dined alone in lodgings except for tonight, and in pity for him, life being now strong enough to bear her on again, she began all this business, as a sailor not without weariness sees the wind fill his sail, and yet hardly wants to be off again, and thinks how, had the ship sunk, he would have whirled round and found rest on the floor of the sea. "Did you find your letters? I told them to put them in the hall for you," she said to William Banks. Lily Briscoe watched her drifting into that strange no-man's land, where to follow people is impossible, and yet their going inflicts such a chill on those who watch them, that they always try at least to follow them with their eyes, as one follows a fading ship until the sails have sunk beneath the horizon. How old she looks, how worn she looks, Lily thought, and how remote. Then, when she turned to William Banks, smiling, it was as if the ship had turned and the sun had struck its sails again, and Lily thought, with some amusement, because she was relieved, why does she pity him? For that was the impression she gave, when she told him that his letters were in the hall. Poor William Banks, she seemed to be saying, as if her own weariness had been partly pitying people, and the life in her, her resolve to live again, had been stirred by pity. And it was not true, Lily thought. It was one of those misjudgments of hers that seemed to be instinctive, and to arise from some need of her own, rather than of other people's. He is not in the least pitiable. He has his work, Lily said to herself. She remembered, all of a sudden, as if she had found a treasure, that she had her work. In a flash she saw her picture, and thought, yes, I shall put the tree further in the middle, then I shall avoid that awkward space. That's what I shall do. That's what has been puzzling me. She took up the salt cellar and put it down again on a flower pattern in the tablecloth, so as to remind herself to move the tree. It's odd that one scarcely gets anything worth having by post, yet one always wants one's letters, said Mr. Banks. What damned rot they talk, thought Charles Tansley, laying down his spoon precisely in the middle of his plate, which he had swept clean, as if, Lily thought, He sat opposite to her, with his back to the window precisely in the middle of view. He was determined to make sure of his meals. Everything about him had that meagre fixity, that bare unloveliness. But nevertheless, the fact remained, it was impossible to dislike anyone if one looked at them. She liked his eyes. They were blue, deep-set, frightening. "Do you write many letters, Mr. Tansley?" asked Mrs. Ramsay, pitying him too, Lily supposed. For that was true of Mrs. Ramsay. She pitied men always as if they lacked something, women never as if they had something. "He wrote to his mother, otherwise he did not suppose he wrote one letter a month," said Mr. Tansley shortly. For he was not going to talk the sort of rot these condescended to by these silly women. He had been reading in his room, and now he came down and it all seemed to him silly, superficial, flimsy. Why did they dress? He had come down in his ordinary clothes. He had not got any dress clothes. One never gets anything worth having by post. That was the sort of thing they were always saying. They made men say that sort of thing. Yes, it was pretty well true, he thought. They never got anything worth having from one year's end to another. They did nothing but talk, 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 eat, eat, eat. It was the women's fault. Women made civilization impossible with all their charm, all their silliness. "No going to the Lighthouse tomorrow, Mrs. Ramsay," he said, asserting himself. He liked her. He admired her. He still thought of the man in the drain-pipe looking up at her, but he felt it necessary to assert himself. He was really, Lily Briscoe thought, in spite of his eyes, but then look at his nose, look at his hands, the most uncharming human being she had ever met. Then why did she mind what he said? Women can't write, women can't paint. What did that matter coming from him, since clearly it was not true to him, but for some reason helpful to him, and that was why he said it? Why did her whole being bow, like corn under a wind, and erect itself again from this abasement only with a great and rather painful effort? She must make it once more. There's the sprig on the tablecloth. There's my painting. I must move the tree to the middle. That matters, nothing else. Could she not hold fast to that, she asked herself, and not lose her temper, and not argue, and if she wanted revenge, take it by laughing at him? "Oh, Mr. Tansley," she said, "do take me to the lighthouse with you. I should so love it." She was telling lies, he could see. She was saying what she did not mean to annoy him for some reason. She was laughing at him. He was in his old flannel trousers. He had no others. He felt very rough and isolated and lonely. He knew that she was trying to tease him for some reason. She didn't want to go to the lighthouse with him. She despised him. So did Prue Ramsay. So did they all. But he was not going to be made a fool of by women, so he turned deliberately in his chair and looked out of the window, and said, all in a jerk, very rudely, it would be too rough for her tomorrow. She would be sick. It annoyed him that she should have made him speak like that, with Mrs. Ramsay listening. If only he could be alone in his room, working, he thought, among his books. That was where he felt at his ease. And he had never run a penny into debt. He had never cost his father a penny since he was 15. He had helped them at home out of his savings. He was educating his sister. Still, he wished he had known how to answer Miss Briscoe properly. He wished it had not come out all in a jerk like that. "You'd be sick." He wished he could think of something to say to Mrs. Ramsay, something which would show her that he was not just a dry prig. That was what they all thought about him. He turned to her. But Mrs. Ramsay was talking about people he had never heard of to William Banks. "Yes, take it away," she said briefly, interrupting what she was saying to William Banks to speak to the maid. "It must have been 15, no, 20 years ago that I last saw her," she was saying, turning back to him again as if she could not lose a moment of their talk, for she was absorbed by what they were saying. So he had actually heard from her this evening. And was Carrie still living at Marlow, and was everything still the same? Oh, she could remember it as if it were yesterday, on the river, feeling it as if it were yesterday, going on the river, feeling very cold. But if the Mannings made a plan they stuck to it. Never should she forget Herbert killing a wasp with a teaspoon on the bank. And it was still going on, Mrs. Ramsay mused, gliding like a ghost among the chairs and tables of that drawing-room on the banks of the Thames where she had been so very, very cold 20 years ago. But now she went among them like a ghost, and it fascinated her, as if, while she had changed, that particular day, now become very still and beautiful, had remained there all these years. Had Carrie written to him herself, she asked. Yes, she says they're building a new billiard-room, he said. No, no, that was out of the question. Building a new billiard-room. It seemed to her impossible. Mr. Banks could not see that there was anything very odd about it. They were very well off now. Should he give her love to Carrie? Oh, said Mrs. Ramsay with a little start. No, she added, reflecting that she did not know this Carrie who built a new billiard-room. But how strange, she repeated, to Mr. Banks's amusement, that they should be going on there still. For it was extraordinary to think that they had been capable of going on living all these years when she had not thought of them more than once all that time. How eventful her own life had been during those same years. Yet perhaps Carrie Manning had not thought about her either. The thought was strange and distasteful. People soon drift apart, said Mr. Banks, feeling, however, some satisfaction when he thought that after all he knew both the Mannings and the Ramsays. He had not drifted apart, he thought, laying down his spoon and wiping his clean-shaven lips punctiliously. But perhaps he was rather unusual, he thought, in this. He never let himself get into a groove. He had friends in all circles. Mrs. Ramsay had to break off here to tell the maid something about keeping food hot. That was why he preferred dining alone. All those interruptions annoyed him. Well, thought William Banks, preserving a demeanour of exquisite courtesy, and merely spreading the fingers of his left hand on the tablecloth, as a mechanic examines a tool beautifully polished and ready for use in an interval of leisure. Such are the sacrifices one's friends ask of one. It would have hurt her if he had refused to come. But it was not worth it for him. Looking at his hand, he thought that, if he had been alone, dinner would have been almost over now, he would have been free to work. Yes, he thought, it is a terrible waste of time. The children were dropping in still. I wish one of you would run up to Roger's room, Mrs. Ramsay was saying. How trifling it all is, how boring it all is, he thought, compared with the other thing, work. Here he sat drumming his fingers on the tablecloth when he might have been. He took a flashing bird's-eye view of his work. What a waste of time it all was, to be sure. Yet, he thought, she is one of my oldest friends. I am by way of being devoted to her. Yet now, at this moment, her presence meant absolutely nothing to him. Her beauty meant nothing to him. Her sitting with her little boy at the window, nothing, nothing. He wished only to be alone and to take up that book. He felt uncomfortable. He felt treacherous, that he could sit by her side and feel nothing for her. The truth was that he did not enjoy family life. It was in this sort of state that one asked oneself, what does one live for? Why, one asked oneself, does one take all these pains for the human race to go on? Is it so very desirable? Are we attractive as a species? Not so very, he thought, looking at those rather untidy boys. His favourite, Cam, was in bed, he supposed. Foolish questions, vain questions, questions one never asked if one was occupied. Is human life this? Is human life that? One never had time to think about it. But here he was asking himself that sort of question, because Mrs. Ramsay was giving orders to servants. and also because it had struck him, thinking how surprised Mrs. Ramsay was that Carrie Mannings should still exist, that friendships, even the best of them, are frail things. One drifts apart. He reproached himself again. He was sitting beside Mrs. Ramsay, and he had nothing in the world to say to her. "I'm so sorry," said Mrs. Ramsay, turning to him at last. He felt rigid and barren, like a pair of boots that have been soaked and gone dry so that you can hardly force your feet into them. Yet he must force his feet into them. He must make himself talk. Unless he were very careful, she would find out this treachery of his, that he did not care a straw for her, and that would not be at all pleasant, he thought. So he bent his head courteously in her direction. "How you must detest dining in this bear garden," she said, making use, as she did when she was distracted, of her social manner. So, when there is a strife of tongues, at some meeting, the chairman, to obtain unity, suggests that everyone shall speak in French. Perhaps it is bad French. French may not contain the words that express the speaker's thoughts. Nevertheless, speaking French imposes some order, some uniformity. Replying to her in the same language, Mr. Banks said, "No, not at all." And Mr. Tansley, who had no knowledge of this language, even spoke thus in words of one syllable, at once suspected its insincerity. They did talk nonsense, he thought, the Ramsays, and he pounced on this fresh instance with joy, making a note which, one of these days, he would read aloud to one or two friends. There, in a society where one could say what one liked, he would sarcastically describe staying with the Ramsays, and what nonsense they talked. It was worth while doing it once, he would say, but not again. The women bored one so, he would say. Of course Ramsay had dished himself by marrying a beautiful woman and having 8 children. It would shape itself something like that, but now, at this moment, sitting stuck there with an empty seat beside him, nothing had shaped itself at all. It was all in scraps and fragments. He felt extremely, even physically uncomfortable. He wanted somebody to give him a chance of asserting himself. He wanted it so urgently that he fidgeted in his chair, looked at this person, then at that person, tried to break into their talk, opened his mouth and shut it again. They were talking about the fishing industry. Why did nobody ask him his opinion? What did they know about the fishing industry? Lily Briscoe knew all that. Sitting opposite him, could she not see, as in an X-ray photograph, the ribs and thigh bones of the young man's desire to impress himself, lying dark in the mist of his flesh, that thin mist which convention had laid over his burning desire to break into the conversation. But, she thought, screwing up her Chinese eyes, and remembering how he sneered at women, "Can't paint, can't write. Why should I help him relieve himself?" There is a code of behaviour, she knew, whose 7th article, it may be, says that on occasions of this sort it behoves the woman, whatever her own occupation might be, to go to the help of the young man opposite, so that he may expose and relieve the thigh bones, the ribs, of his vanity, of his urgent desire to assert himself. As indeed it is their duty, she reflected, in her old maidenly fairness, to help us, suppose the tube were to burst into flames. Then, she thought, I should certainly expect Mr. Tansley to get me out. But how would it be, she thought, if neither of us did either of those things? So she sat there smiling. "You're not planning to go to the lighthouse, are you, Lily?" said Mrs. Ramsay. "Remember poor Mr. Langley? He had been round the world dozens of times, but he told me he never suffered as he did when my husband took him there. Are you a good sailor, Mr. Tansley?" she asked. Mr. Tansley raised a hammer, swung it high in air, but realizing, as it descended, that he could not smite that butterfly with such an instrument as this, said only that he had never been sick in his life. But in that one sentence lay compact, like gunpowder, that his grandfather was a fisherman, his father a chemist, that he had worked his way up entirely himself, that he was proud of it, that he was Charles Tansley, a fact that nobody there seemed to realise, but one of these days every single person would know it. He scowled ahead of him. He could almost pity these mild, cultivated people who would be blown sky-high like bales of wool and barrels of apples one of these days by the gunpowder that was in him. "Will you take me, Mr. Tansley?" said Lily quickly, kindly, for of course, if Mrs. Ramsay said to her, as in effect she did, "I am drowning, my dear, in seas of fire. Unless you apply some balm to the anguish of this hour, and say something nice to that young man there, life will run upon the rocks. Indeed, I hear the grating and the growling at this minute. My nerves are as taut as fiddle strings. Another touch and they will snap." When Mrs. Ramsay said all this, as the glance in her eyes said it, of course for the 150th time, Lily Briscoe had to renounce the experiment. What happens if one is not nice to that young man there? And be nice. Judging the turn in her mood correctly, that she was friendly to him now, he was relieved of his egotism, and told her how he had been thrown out of a boat when he was a baby, how his father used to fish him out with a boat-hook. That was how he had learned to swim. One of his uncles kept the light on some rock or other off the Scottish coast, he said. He had been there with him in a storm. This was said loudly in a pause. They had to listen to him when he said that he had been with his uncle in a lighthouse in a storm. Ah, thought Lily Briscoe, as the conversation took this auspicious turn, and she felt Mrs. Ramsay's gratitude, for Mrs. Ramsay was free now to talk for a moment herself. Ah, she thought, but what haven't I paid to get it for you? She had not been sincere. She had done the usual trick, been nice. She would never know him. He would never know her. Human relations were all like that, she thought, and the worst, if it had not been for Mr. Banks, were between men and women. Inevitably these were extremely insincere, she thought. Then her eye caught the salt cellar, which she had placed there to remind her, and she remembered that next morning she would move the tree further towards the middle, and her spirits rose so high at the thought of painting tomorrow that she laughed out loud at what Mr. Tansley was saying. Let him talk all night if he liked it. "But how long do they leave men on a lighthouse?" she asked. He told her. He was amazingly well informed. And as he was grateful, and as he liked her, and as he was beginning to enjoy himself, so now, Mrs. Ramsay thought, she could return to that dreamland, that unreal but fascinating place, the Mannings' drawing-room at Marlow 20 years ago, where one moved about without haste or anxiety, for there was no future to worry about. She knew what had happened to them, what to her. It was like reading a good book again, for she knew the end of that story, since it had happened 20 years ago, and life, which shot down even from this dining-room table in cascades, heaven knows where, was sealed up there, and lay, like a lake, placidly between its banks. He said they had built a billiard-room. Was it possible? Would William go on talking about the Mannings? She wanted him to. But no, for some reason he was no longer in the mood. She tried. He did not respond. She could not force him. She was disappointed. "The children are disgraceful," she said, sighing. He said something about punctuality being one of the minor virtues which we do not acquire until later in life. "If at all," said Mrs. Ramsay, merely to fill up space, thinking what an old maid William was becoming. Conscious of his treachery, conscious of her wish to talk about something more intimate, yet out of mood for it at present, he felt come over him the disagreeableness of life, sitting there, waiting. Perhaps the others were saying something interesting. What were they saying? That the fishing season was bad, that the men were emigrating. They were talking about wages and unemployment. The young man was abusing the government. William Banks, thinking what a relief it was to catch on to something of this sort when private life was disagreeable, heard him say something about, One of the most scandalous acts of the present government. Lily was listening. Mrs. Ramsay was listening. They were all listening. But, already bored, Lily felt that something was lacking. Mr. Banks felt that something was lacking. Pulling her shawl round her, Mrs. Ramsay felt that something was lacking. All of them, bending themselves to listen, thought, "Pray heaven that the inside of my mind may not be exposed." For each thought, "The others are feeling this. They are outraged and indignant with the government about the fishermen, whereas I feel nothing at all." But perhaps, thought Mr. Banks, as he looked at Mr. Tansley, here is the man. One was always waiting for the man. There was always a chance. At any moment the leader might arise, the man of genius, in politics as in anything else. Probably he will be extremely disagreeable to us old fogies, thought Mr. Banks, doing his best to make allowances, for he knew by some curious physical sensation, as of nerves erect in his spine, that he was jealous, for himself partly more probably for his work, for his point of view, for his science, and therefore he was not entirely open-minded or altogether fair, for Mr. Tansley seemed to be saying, "You have wasted your lives. You are all of you wrong. Poor old fogies, you're hopelessly behind the times." He seemed to be rather cocksure, this young man, and his manners were bad. But Mr. Banks bade himself observe, he had courage, he had ability, he was extremely well up in the facts. Probably, Mr. Banks thought, as Tansley abused the government, there is a good deal in what he says. "Tell me now," he said. So they argued about politics, and Lily looked at the leaf on the tablecloth, and Mrs. Ramsay, leaving the argument entirely in the hands of the two men, wondered why she was so bored by this talk, and wished, looking at her husband at the other end of the table, that he would say something. One word, she said to herself. For if he said a thing, it would make all the difference. He went to the heart of things. He cared about fishermen and their wages. He could not sleep for thinking of them. It was altogether different when he spoke. One did not feel then, "Pray heaven you don't see how little I care," because one did care. Then, realizing that it was because she admired him so much that she was waiting for him to speak, she felt as if somebody had been praising her husband to her and her marriage. And she glowed all over without realizing that it was she herself who had praised him. She looked at him, thinking to find this in his face, he would be looking magnificent. But not in the least. He was screwing his face up, he was scowling and frowning and flushing with anger. What on earth was it about, she wondered? What could be the matter? Only that poor old Augustus had asked for another plate of soup, that was all. It was unthinkable, it was detestable, so he signalled to her across the table, that Augustus should be beginning his soup over again. He loathed people eating when he had finished. She saw his anger fly like a pack of hounds into his eyes, his brow, and she knew that in a moment something violent would explode, and then, thank goodness, she saw him clutch himself and clap a brake on the wheel, and the whole of his body seemed to emit sparks, but not words. He sat there scowling. He had said nothing. He would have her observe. Let her give him the credit for that. But why, after all, should poor Augustus not ask for another plate of soup? He had merely touched Ellen's arm and said, "Ellen, please, another plate of soup." And then Mr. Ramsay scowled like that. And why not? Mrs. Ramsay demanded. Surely they could let Augustus have his soup if he wanted it. He hated people wallowing in food, Mr. Ramsay frowned at her. He hated everything dragging on for hours like this. But he had controlled himself, Mr. Ramsay would have her observe, disgusting though the sight was. But why show it so plainly? Mrs. Ramsay demanded. They looked at each other down the long table, sending these questions and answers across, each knowing exactly what the other felt. Everybody could see, Mrs. Ramsay thought. There was Rose gazing at her father, there was Roger gazing at his father. Both would be off in spasms of laughter in another second, she knew, and so she said promptly—indeed it was time—"Light the candles!" And they jumped up instantly and went and fumbled at the sideboard. Why could he never conceal his feelings, Mrs. Ramsay wondered, and she wondered if Augustus Carmichael had noticed. Perhaps he had, perhaps he had not. She could not help respecting the composure with which he sat there, drinking his soup. If he wanted soup, he asked for soup. Whether people laughed at him or were angry with him, he was the same. He did not like her, she knew that, but partly for that very reason she respected him, and looking at him, drinking soup, very large and calm in the failing light, and monumental and contemplative, she wondered what he did feel then, and why he was always content and dignified, and she thought how devoted he was to Andrew, and would call him into his room, and Andrew said, "Show him things." And there he would lie all day long on the lawn, brooding presumably over his poetry, till he reminded one of a cat watching birds, and then he clapped his paws together when he had found the word, and her husband said, "Poor old Augustus, he's a true poet," which was high praise from her husband. Now 8 candles were stood down the table, and after the first stoop the flame stood upright and drew with them into visibility the long table entire, and in the middle a yellow and purple dish of fruit. What had she done with it, Mrs. Ramsay wondered, for Rose's arrangement of the grapes and pears, of the horny pink-lined shell, of the bananas, made her think of a trophy fetched from the bottom of the sea, of Neptune's banquet, of the bunch that hangs with vine leaves over the shoulder of Bacchus, in some picture, among the leopard skins and the torches lolloping red and gold. Thus brought up suddenly into the light, it seemed possessed of great size and depth, was like a world in which one could take one's staff and climb hills, she thought, and go down into valleys, and, to her pleasure, for it brought them into sympathy momentarily, she saw that Augustus too feasted his eyes on the same plate of fruit, plunged in, broke off a bloom here, a tassel there, and returned, after feasting, to his hive. That was his way of looking, different from hers, but looking together united them. Chapter 17 continued. Now all the candles were lit up, and the faces on both sides of the table were brought nearer by the candlelight, and composed, as they had not been in the twilight, into a party round a table, for the night was now shut off by panes of glass, which, far from giving any accurate view of the outside world, rippled it so strangely that here, inside the room, seemed to be order and dry land; there, outside, a reflection in which things waved and vanished waterily. Some change at once went through them all, as if this had really happened, and they were all conscious of making a party together in a hollow on an island, had their common cause against that fluidity out there. Mrs. Ramsay, who had been uneasy, waiting for Paul and Minta to come in, and unable, she felt, to settle to things, now felt her uneasiness changed to expectation. For now they must come, and Lily Briscoe, trying to analyse the cause of the sudden exhilaration, compared it with that moment on the tennis lawn when solidity suddenly vanished, and such vast spaces lay between them. And now the same effect was got by the many candles in the sparely furnished room, and the uncurtained windows, and the bright, mask-like look of faces seen by candlelight. Some weight was taken off them. Anything might happen, she felt. They must come now, Mrs. Ramsay thought, looking at the door, and, at that instant, Minta Doyle, Paul Rayleigh, and a maid carrying a great dish in her hands came in together. They were awfully late. They were horribly late, Minta said, as they found their way to different ends of the table. "I lost my brooch, my grandmother's brooch," said Minta, with a sound of lamentation in her voice, and a suffusion in her large brown eyes, looking down, looking up, as she sat by Mr. Ramsay, which roused his chivalry so that he bantered her. How could she be such a goose, he asked, as to scramble about the rocks in jewels? She was by way of being terrified of him, he was so fearfully clever, and the first night when she had sat by him and he talked about George Eliot, she had been really frightened, for she had left the 3rd volume of Middlemarch in the train, and she never knew what happened in the end. But afterwards she got on perfectly, and made herself out even more ignorant than she was, because he liked telling her she was a fool. And so to-night, directly he laughed at her, she was not frightened. Besides, she knew, directly she came into the room, that the miracle had happened. She wore her golden haze. Sometimes she had it, sometimes not. She never knew why it came or why it went, or if she had it until she came into the room, and then she knew instantly by the way some man looked at her. Yes, to-night she had it, tremendously. She knew that by the way Mr. Ramsay told her not to be a fool. She sat beside him, smiling. It must have happened, then, thought Mrs. Ramsay. They are engaged. And for a moment she felt what she had never expected to feel again— jealousy. For he, her husband, felt it too— Minta's glow. He liked these girls, these golden reddish girls, with something flying, something a little wild and harum-scarum about them, who didn't "scrape their hair off," weren't, as he said about poor Lily Briscoe, skimpy. There was some quality which she herself had not, some lustre, some richness, which attracted him, amused him, led him to make favourites of girls like Minta. They might cut his hair from him, plait him watch chains, or interrupt him at his work, hailing him. She heard them. "Come along, Mr. Ramsay, it's our turn to beat them now." And out he came to play tennis. But indeed she was not jealous, only, now and then, when she made herself look in her glass, a little resentful that she had grown old, perhaps by her own fault. The bill for the greenhouse and all the rest of it. She was grateful to them for laughing at him. "How many pipes have you smoked to-day, Mr. Ramsay?" and so on. Till he seemed a young man, a man very attractive to women, not burdened, not weighed down with the greatness of his labours and the sorrows of the world and his fame or his failure, but again as she had first known him, gaunt but gallant, helping her out of a boat, she remembered, with delightful ways, like that. She looked at him, and he looked astonishingly young, teasing Minta. For herself, "Put it down there," she said, helping the Swiss girl to place gently before her the huge brown pot in which was the bœuf en daube. For her own part, she liked her boobies. Paul must sit by her. She had kept a place for him. Really, she sometimes thought she liked the boobies best. They did not bother one with their dissertations. How much they missed, after all, these very clever men! How dried up they did become, to be sure! There was something, she thought as he sat down, very charming about Paul. His manners were delightful to her, and his sharp-cut nose and his bright blue eyes. He was so considerate. Would he tell her, now that they were all talking again, what had happened? "We went back to look for Minta's brooch," he said, sitting down by her. "We." That was enough. She knew from the effort, the rise in his voice to surmount a difficult word, that it was the first time he had said "we." We did this, we did that. They'll say that all their lives, she thought, and an exquisite scent of olives and oil and juice rose from the great brown dish as Martha, with a little flourish, took the cover off. The cook had spent 3 days over that dish. And she must take great care, Mrs. Ramsay thought, diving into the soft mass, to choose a specially tender piece for William Banks. And she peered into the dish, with its shiny walls and its confusion of savoury brown and yellow meats, and its bay leaves and its wine, and thought, "This will celebrate the occasion," a curious sense rising in her, at once freakish and tender, of celebrating a festival, as if two emotions were called up in her, one profound, for what could be more serious than the love of man for woman? What more commanding, more impressive, bearing in its bosom the seeds of death? At the same time these lovers, these people entering into illusion glittering-eyed, must be danced round with mockery, decorated with garlands. "It is a triumph," said Mr. Banks, laying his knife down for a moment. He had eaten attentively. It was rich, it was tender, it was perfectly cooked. How did she manage these things in the depths of the country, he asked her. She was a wonderful woman. All his love, all his reverence had returned, and she knew it. "It is a French recipe of my grandmother's," said Mrs. Ramsay, speaking with a ring of great pleasure in her voice. Of course it was French. What passes for cookery in England is an abomination, they agreed. It is putting cabbages in water. It is roasting meat till it is like leather. It is cutting off the delicious skins of vegetables. "In which," said Mr. Banks, "all the virtue of the vegetable is contained." "And the waste," said Mrs. Ramsay. "A whole French family could live on what an English cook throws away." Spurred on by her sense that William's affection had come back to her, and that everything was all right again, and that her suspense was over, and that now she was free to both triumph and to mock, she laughed, she gesticulated, till Lily thought how childlike, how absurd she was, sitting up there with all her beauty opened in her again, talking about the skins of vegetables. There was something frightening about her. She was irresistible. Always she got her own way in the end, Lily thought. Now she had brought this off. Paul and Minter, one might suppose, were engaged. Mr. Banks was dining here. She put a spell on them all, by wishing, so simply, so directly, and Lily contrasted that abundance with her own poverty of spirit, and supposed that it was partly that belief, for her face was all lit up. Without looking young, she looked radiant. In this strange, this terrifying thing, which made Paul Rayleigh, sitting at her side, all of a tremor, yet abstract, absorbed, silent. Mrs. Ramsay, Lily felt, as she talked about the skins of vegetables, exalted that, worshipped that, held her hands over it to warm them, to protect it, and yet, having brought it all about, somehow laughed, led her victims, Lily felt, to the altar. It came over her too now, the emotion, the vibration of love. How inconspicuous she felt herself by Paul's side. He glowing, burning, she aloof, satirical. He bound for adventure, she moored to the shore. He launched, incautious, she solitary, left out, and ready to implore a share, if it were a disaster, in his disaster. She said shyly, "When did Minter lose her brooch?" He smiled the most exquisite smile, veiled by memory, tinged by dreams. He shook his head. "On the beach," he said. "I'm going to find it," he said. "I'm getting up early." This being kept secret from Minter, he lowered his voice, and turned his eyes to where she sat, laughing, beside Mr. Ramsay. Lily wanted to protest violently and outrageously her desire to help him, envisaging how in the dawn on the beach she would be the one to pounce on the brooch half hidden by some stone, and thus herself be included among the sailors and adventurers. But what did he reply to her offer? She actually said with an emotion that she seldom let appear, "Let me come with you," and he laughed. He meant yes or no, either perhaps, but it was not his meaning, it was the odd chuckle he gave, as if he had said, "Throw yourself over the cliff if you like, I don't care." He turned on her cheek the heat of love, its horror, its cruelty, its unscrupulosity. It scorched her, and Lily, looking at Minter, being charming to Mr. Ramsay at the other end of the table, flinched for her exposed to these fangs, and was thankful. For at any rate, she said to herself, catching sight of the salt-cellar on the pattern, she need not marry, thank heaven, she need not undergo that degradation. She was saved from that dilution. She would move the tree rather more to the middle. Such was the complexity of things. For what happened to her, especially staying with the Ramsays, was to be made to feel violently two opposite things at the same time. That's what you feel was one, that's what I feel was the other, and then they fought together in her mind, as now. It is so beautiful, so exciting, this love, that I tremble on the verge of it, and offer, quite out of my own habit, to look for a brooch on a beach. Also it is the stupidest, the most barbaric of human passions, and turns a nice young man with a profile like a gem's— Paul's was exquisite—into a bully with a crowbar. He was swaggering, he was insolent, in the Mile End Road. Yet, she said to herself, from the dawn of time odes have been sung to love, wreaths heaped and roses, and if you asked 9 people out of 10, they would say they wanted nothing but this, love. While the women, judging from her own experience, would all the time be feeling, this is not what we want, there is nothing more tedious, puerile, and inhumane than this, yet it is also beautiful and necessary. Well then, she asked, somehow expecting the others to go on with the argument, as if in an argument like this one threw one's own little bolt, which fell short obviously, and left the others to carry it on. So she listened again to what they were saying in case they should throw any light upon the question of love. "Then," said Mr. Banks, "there is that liquid the English call coffee." "Oh, coffee!" said Mrs. Ramsay. But it was much rather a question. She was thoroughly roused, Lily could see, and talked very emphatically, of real butter and clean milk. Speaking with warmth and eloquence, she described the iniquity of the English dairy system, and in what state milk was delivered at the door, and was about to prove her charges, for she had gone into the matter, when all round the table, beginning with Andrew in the middle, like a fire leaping from tuft to tuft of furze, her children laughed, her husband laughed, she was laughed at, fire encircled, and forced to veil her crest, dismount her batteries, and only retaliate by displaying the raillery and ridicule of the table to Mr. Banks as an example of what one suffered if one attacked the prejudices of the British public. Purposely, however, for she had it on her mind that Lily, who had helped her with Mr. Tansley, was out of things, she exempted her from the rest, said, "Lily anyhow agrees with me," and so drew her in, a little fluttered, a little startled, for she was thinking about love. They were both out of things, Mrs. Ramsay had been thinking, both Lily and Charles Tansley. Both suffered from the glow of the other two. He, it was clear, felt himself utterly in the cold. No woman would look at him with Paul Rayleigh in the room. Poor fellow! Still, he had his dissertation, the influence of somebody upon something. He could take care of himself. With Lily it was different. She faded under Minter's glow, became more inconspicuous than ever, in her little grey dress with her little puckered face and her little Chinese eyes. Everything about her was so small. Yet, thought Mrs. Ramsay, comparing her with Minter, as she claimed her help, for Lily should bear her out, she talked no more about her dairies than her husband did about his boots. He would talk by the hour about his boots. Of the two, Lily at 40 will be the better. There was in Lily a thread of something, a flare of something of her own which Mrs. Ramsay liked very much indeed, but no man would, she feared. Obviously, not unless it were a much older man, like William Banks. But then he cared— well, Mrs. Ramsay sometimes thought that he cared, since his wife's death, perhaps for her. He was not in love, of course. It was one of those unclassified affections of which there are so many. Oh, but nonsense, she thought. William must marry Lily. They have so many things in common. Lily is so fond of flowers. They are both cold and aloof and rather self-sufficing. She must arrange for them to take a long walk together. Foolishly, she had set them opposite each other. That could be remedied tomorrow. If it were fine, they should go for a picnic. Everything seemed possible. Everything seemed right. Just now. But this cannot last, she thought, dissociating herself from the moment while they were all talking about boots. Just now she had reached security. She hovered like a hawk suspended, like a flag floated in an element of joy which filled every nerve of her body fully and sweetly, not noisily, solemnly rather, for it arose, she thought, looking at them all eating there, from husband and children and friends, all of which rising in this profound stillness. She was helping William Banks to one very small piece more, and peered into the depths of the earthenware pot, seemed now, for no special reason, to stay there like a smoke, like a fume rising upwards, holding them safe together. Nothing need be said. Nothing could be said. There it was, all round them. It partook, she felt, carefully helping Mr. Banks to a specially tender piece, of eternity, as she had already felt about something different once before that afternoon. There is a coherence in things, a stability. Something, she meant, is immune from change, and shines out. She glanced at the window with its ripple of reflected lights, in the face of the flowing, the fleeting, the spectral, like a ruby. So that again tonight she had the feeling she had had once today already, of peace, of rest. Of such moments, she thought, the thing is made that endures. Yes, she assured William Banks, there is plenty for everybody. Andrew, she said, hold your plate lower or I shall spill it. The Bouffon daube was a perfect triumph. Here, she felt, putting the spoon down, where one could move or rest, could wait now, they were all helped, listening, could then, like a hawk which lapses suddenly from its high station, flaunt and sink on laughter easily, resting her whole weight upon what at the other end of the table her husband was saying about the square root of 1253. That was the number, it seemed, on his watch. What did it all mean? To this day she had no notion. A square root. What was that? Her sons knew. She leant on them, on cubes and square roots. That was what they were talking about now, on Voltaire and Madame de Staël, on the character of Napoleon, on the French system of land tenure, on Lord Rosebery, on Creevy's memoirs. She let it uphold her and sustain her, this admirable fabric of the masculine intelligence, which ran up and down, crossed this way and that, like iron girders spanning the swaying fabric, upholding the world, so that she could trust herself to it utterly, even shut her eyes, or flicker them for a moment, as a child staring up from its pillow winks at the myriad layers of the leaves of a tree. Then she woke up. It was still being fabricated. William Banks was praising the Waverley novels. He read one of them every 6 months, he said. And why should that make Charles Tansley angry? He rushed in. All, thought Mrs. Ramsay, because Prue will not be nice to him, and denounced the Waverley novels when he knew nothing about it whatsoever, Mrs. Ramsay thought, observing him rather than listening to what he said. She could see how it was from his manner. He wanted to assert himself, and so it would always be with him, till he got his professorship or married his wife, and so need not always be saying, I. For that was what his criticism of poor Sir Walter, Or perhaps it was Jane Austen, amounted to. I. He was thinking of himself and the impression he was making, as she could tell by the sound of his voice, and his emphasis and his uneasiness. Success would be good for him. At any rate, they were off again. Now she need not listen. It could not last, she knew, but at the moment her eyes were so clear that they seemed to go round the table unveiling each of these people, and their thoughts and their feelings, without effort, like a light stealing under water, so that its ripples and the reeds in it and the minnows balancing themselves, and the sudden silent trout are all lit up, hanging, trembling. So she saw them, she heard them, but whatever they said had also this quality, as if what they said was like the movement of a trout, when, at the same time, one can see the ripple and the gravel, something to the right, something to the left, and the whole is held together. For whereas in active life she would be netting and separating one thing from another, she would be saying she liked the Waverley novels or had not read them, she would be urging herself forward. Now she said nothing. For the moment she hung suspended. "Ah, but how long do you think it'll last?" said somebody. It was as if she had antennae trembling out from her, which, intercepting certain sentences, forced them upon her attention. This was one of them. She scented danger for her husband. A question like that would lead, almost certainly, to something being said which reminded him of his own failure. How long would he be read, he would think at once. William Banks, who was entirely free from all such vanity, laughed, and said he attached no importance to changes in fashion. Who could tell what was going to last, in literature or indeed in anything else? "Let us enjoy what we do enjoy," he said. His integrity seemed to Mrs. Ramsay quite admirable. He never seemed for a moment to think, "But how does this affect me?" But then if you had the other temperament, which must have praise, which must have encouragement, naturally you began, and she knew that Mr. Ramsay was beginning, to be uneasy, to want somebody to say, "Oh, but your work will last, Mr. Ramsay," or something like that. He showed his uneasiness quite clearly now by saying, with some irritation, that anyhow Scott, or was it Shakespeare, would last him his lifetime. He said it irritably. Everybody, she thought, felt a little uncomfortable, without knowing why. Then Minter Doyle, whose instinct was fine, said bluffly, absurdly, that she did not believe that anyone really enjoyed reading Shakespeare. Mr. Ramsay said grimly, but his mind was turned away again, that very few people liked it as much as they said they did. "But," he added, "there is considerable merit in some of the plays, nevertheless," and Mrs. Ramsay saw that it would be all right for the moment anyhow. He would laugh at Minter, and she, Mrs. Ramsay saw, realizing his extreme anxiety about himself, would, in her own way, see that he was taken care of, and praise him somehow or other. But she wished it was not necessary. Perhaps it was her fault that it was necessary. Anyhow, she was free now to listen to what Paul Rayleigh was trying to say about books one had read as a boy. They lasted, he said. He had read some of Tolstoy at school. There was one he always remembered, but he had forgotten the name. Russian names were impossible, said Mrs. Ramsay. Vronsky, said Paul. He remembered that because he always thought it such a good name for a villain. Vronsky, said Mrs. Ramsay. Oh, Anna Karenina. But that did not take them very far. Books were not in their line. No, Charles Tansley would put them both right in a second about books, but it was all so mixed up with, am I saying the right thing, am I making a good impression, that, after all, one knew more about him than about Tolstoy, whereas what Paul said was about the thing, simply, not himself, nothing else. Like all stupid people, he had a kind of modesty too, a consideration for what you were feeling, which, once in a way at least, she found attractive. Now he was thinking not about himself, or about Tolstoy, but whether she was cold, whether she felt a draught, whether she would like a pear. No, she said, she did not want a pear. Indeed, she had been keeping guard over the dish of fruit, without realizing it, jealously, hoping that nobody would touch it. Her eyes had been going in and out among the curves and shadows of the fruit, among the rich purples of the lowland grapes, then over the horny ridge of the shell, putting a yellow against a purple, a curved shape against a round shape, without knowing why she did it, or why, every time she did it, she felt more and more serene, until, oh what a pity that they should do it, a hand reached out, took a pear, and spoilt the whole thing. In sympathy she looked at Rose. She looked at Rose sitting between Jasper and Prue. How odd that one's child should do that. How odd to see them sitting there in a row, her children, Jasper, Rose, Prue, Andrew, almost silent, but with some joke of their own going on, she guessed, from the twitching at their lips. It was something quite apart from everything else, something they were hoarding up to laugh over in their own room. It was not about their father, she hoped. No, she thought not. What was it, she wondered, sadly rather, for it seemed to her that they would laugh when she was not there. There was all that hoarded behind those rather set, still, mask-like faces, for they did not join in easily. They were like watchers, surveyors, a little raised or set apart from the grown-up people. But when she looked at Prue tonight, she saw that this was not now quite true of her. She was just beginning, just moving, just descending. The faintest light was on her face, as if the glow of Minter opposite, some excitement, some anticipation of happiness was reflected in her, as if the sun of the love of men and women rose over the rim of the tablecloth, and without knowing what it was she bent towards it and greeted it. She kept looking at Minter, shyly yet curiously, so that Mrs. Ramsay looked from one to the other, and said, speaking to Prue in her own mind, "You will be as happy as she is one of these days. You will be much happier," she added, "because you are my daughter," she meant. Her own daughter must be happier than other people's daughters. But dinner was over. It was time to go. They were only playing with things on their plates. She would wait until they had done laughing at some story her husband was telling. He was having a joke with Minter about a bet. Then she would get up. She liked Charles Tansley, she thought suddenly. She liked his laugh. She liked him for being so angry with Paul and Minter. She liked his awkwardness. There was a lot in that young man after all. And Lily, she thought, putting her napkin beside her plate, she always has some joke of her own. One need never bother about Lily. She waited. She tucked her napkin under the edge of her plate. Well, were they done now? No. That story had led to another story. Her husband was in great spirits tonight, and wishing, she supposed, to make it all right with old Augustus after that scene about the soup, had drawn him in. They were telling stories about someone they had both known at college. She looked at the window in which the candle flames burnt brighter now that the panes were black, and looking at that outside, the voices came to her very strangely, as if they were voices at a service in a cathedral, for she did not listen to the words. The sudden bursts of laughter, and then one voice, Minter's, speaking alone, reminded her of men and boys crying out the Latin words of a service in some Roman Catholic cathedral. She waited. Her husband spoke. He was repeating something, and she knew it was poetry from the rhythm and the ring of exultation and melancholy in his voice. Come out and climb the garden path, Luriana, Luralee. The China rose is all abloom and buzzing with the yellow bee. The words, she was looking at the window, sounded as if they were floating like flowers on water out there, cut off from them all, as if no one had said them, but they had come into existence of themselves. And all the lives we ever lived, and all the lives to be, are full of trees and changing leaves. She did not know what they meant, but, like music, the words seemed to be spoken by her own voice, outside herself, saying quite easily and naturally what had been in her mind the whole evening, while she said different things. She knew, without looking round, that everyone at the table was listening to the voice saying, "I wonder if it seems to you, Luriana Luralee," with the same sort of relief and pleasure that she had, as if this were, at last, the natural thing to say, this were their own voice speaking. But the voice had stopped. She looked round. She made herself get up. Augustus Carmichael had risen, and, holding his table napkin so that it looked like a long white robe, he stood chanting. To see the kings go riding by, over lawn and daisy lea, with their palm leaves and cedar, Luriana Luralee. And as she passed him, he turned slightly towards her, repeating the last words, Luriana Luralee, and bowed to her as if he did her homage. Without knowing why, she felt that he liked her better than he had ever done before, and with a feeling of relief and gratitude she returned his bow and passed through the door which he held open for her. It was necessary now to carry everything a step further. With her foot on the threshold, she waited a moment longer, in a scene which was vanishing even as she looked, and then, as she moved and took Minta's arm and left the room, it changed, it shaped itself differently. It had become, she knew, giving one last look at it over her shoulder, already the past. Chapter 18. As usual, Lily thought, there was always something that had to be done at that precise moment, something that Mrs. Ramsay had decided for reasons of her own to do instantly. It might be with everyone standing about making jokes, as now, not being able to decide whether they were going into the smoking-room, into the drawing-room, up to the attics. Then one saw Mrs. Ramsay in the midst of this hubbub, standing there with Minta's arm in hers, bethink her, yes, it is time for that now, and so make off at once with an air of secrecy to do something alone. And directly she went, a sort of disintegration set in. They wavered about, went different ways. Mr. Banks took Charles Tansley by the arm and went off to finish on the terrace the discussion they had begun at dinner about politics, thus giving a turn to the whole poise of the evening, making the weight fall in a different direction, as if, Lily thought, seeing them go, and hearing a word or two about the policy of the Labour Party, they had gone up onto the bridge of the ship and were taking their bearings. The change from poetry to politics struck her like that. So Mr. Banks and Charles, Mrs. Ramsay going upstairs in the lamplight alone. Where, Lily wondered, was she going so quickly? Not that she did, in fact, run or hurry. She went indeed rather slowly. She felt rather inclined, just for a moment, to stand still after all that chatter, and pick out one particular thing, the thing that mattered, to detach it, separate it off, clean it of all the emotions and odds and ends of things, and so hold it before her, and bring it to the tribunal, where, ranged about in conclave, sat the judges she had set up to decide these things. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it right or wrong? Where are we all going to? And so on. So she righted herself after the shock of the event, and quite unconsciously and incongruously used the branches of the elm trees outside to help her stabilize her position. Her world was changing. They were still. The event had given her a sense of movement. All must be in order. She must get that right and that right, she thought, insensibly approving of the dignity of the tree's stillness, and now again of the superb upward rise, like the beak of a ship up a wave, of the elm branches as the wind raised them. For it was windy. She stood a moment to look out. It was windy, so that the leaves now and then brushed open a star, and the stars themselves seemed to be shaking and darting light, and trying to flash out between the edges of the leaves. Yes, that was done then, accomplished, and as with all things done, became solemn. Now one thought of it, cleared of chatter and emotion, it seemed always to have been, only was shown now, and so, being shown, struck everything into stability. They would, she thought, going on again, however long they lived, come back to this night, this moon, this wind, this house, and to her too. It flattered her, where she was most susceptible of flattery, to think how, wound about in their hearts, however long they lived, she would be woven, and this, and this, and this, she thought, going upstairs laughing, but affectionately, at the sofa on the landing, her mother's, at the rocking-chair, her father's, at the map of the Hebrides. All that would be revived again in the lives of Paul and Minta, the Rayleys, she tried the new name over, and she felt, with her hand on the nursery door, that community of feeling with other people which emotion gives, as if the walls of partition had become so thin that practically the feeling was one of relief and happiness. It was all one stream, and chairs, tables, maps, were hers, were theirs, it did not matter whose, and Paul and Minta would carry it on when she was dead. She turned the handle firmly lest it should squeak, and went in, pursing her lips slightly, as if to remind herself that she must not speak aloud. But directly she came in she saw, with annoyance, that the precaution was not needed. The children were not asleep. It was most annoying. Mildred should be more careful. There was James wide awake, and Cam sitting bolt upright, and Mildred out of bed in her bare feet, and it was almost 11, and they were all talking. What was the matter? It was that horrid skull again. She had told Mildred to move it, but Mildred, of course, had forgotten, and now there was Cam wide awake, and James wide awake, quarrelling when they ought to have been asleep hours ago. What had possessed Edward to send them this horrid skull? She had been so foolish as to let them nail it up there. It was nailed fast, Mildred said, and Cam couldn't go to sleep with it in the room, and James screamed if she touched it. Then Cam must go to sleep. It had great horns, said Cam. Must go to sleep and dream of lovely palaces, said Mrs. Ramsay, sitting down on the bed by her side. She could see the horns, Cam said, all over the room. It was true. Wherever they put the light, and James could not sleep without a light, there was always a shadow somewhere. "But think, Cam, it's only an old pig," said Mrs. Ramsay. "A nice black pig like the pigs at the farm." But Cam thought it was a horrid thing, branching at her all over the room. "Well then," said Mrs. Ramsay, "we will cover it up." And they all watched her go to the chest of drawers, and open the little drawers quickly one after another, and not seeing anything that would do, she quickly took her own shawl off and wound it round the skull, round and round and round, and then she came back to Cam and laid her head almost flat on the pillow beside Cam's, and said how lovely it looked now, how the fairies would love it. It was like a bird's nest. It was like a beautiful mountain such as she had seen abroad, with valleys and flowers and bells ringing and birds singing and little goats and antelopes and... She could see the words echoing as she spoke them rhythmically in Cam's mind, and Cam was repeating after her how it was like a mountain, a bird's nest, a garden, and there were little antelopes, and her eyes were opening and shutting, and Mrs. Ramsay went on speaking still more monotonously, and more rhythmically, and more nonsensically, how she must shut her eyes and go to sleep, and dream of mountains and valleys and stars falling and parrots and antelopes and gardens and everything lovely, she said, raising her head very slowly and speaking more and more mechanically until she sat upright and saw that Cam was asleep. "Now," she whispered, crossing over to his bed, "James must go to sleep too. For see," she said, "the boar's skull was still there. They had not touched it. They had done just what he wanted. It was there quite unhurt." He made sure that the skull was still there under the shawl. But he wanted to ask her something more. Would they go to the lighthouse tomorrow? No, not tomorrow, she said, but soon, she promised him, the next fine day. He was very good. He lay down. She covered him up. But he would never forget, she knew, and she felt angry with Charles Tansley, with her husband, and with herself, for she had raised his hopes. Then, feeling for her shawl and remembering that she had wrapped it round the boar's skull, she got up and pulled the window down another inch or two, and heard the wind, and got a breath of the perfectly indifferent chill night air, and murmured good night to Mildred, and left the room, and let the tongue of the door slowly lengthen in the lock, and went out. She hoped he would not bang his books on the floor above their heads, she thought, still thinking how annoying Charles Tansley was. For neither of them slept well, they were excitable children, and since he said things like that about the lighthouse, it seemed to her likely that he would knock a pile of books over, just as they were going to sleep, clumsily sweeping them off the table with his elbow. For she supposed that he had gone upstairs to work. Yet he looked so desolate. Yet she would feel relieved when he went. Yet she would see that he was better treated tomorrow. Yet he was admirable with her husband. Yet his manners certainly wanted improving. Yet she liked his laugh. Thinking this, as she came downstairs, she noticed that she could now see the moon itself through the staircase window, the yellow harvest moon, and turned, and they saw her standing above them on the stairs. "That's my mother," thought Prue. Yes, Minta should look at her, Paul Rayleigh should look at her. That is the thing itself, she felt, as if there were only one person like that in the world, her mother. And, from having been quite grown up a moment before, talking with the others, she became a child again, and what they had been doing was a game, and would her mother sanction their game or condemn it, she wondered. And thinking what a chance it was for Minta and Paul and Lily to see her, and feeling what an extraordinary stroke of fortune it was for her to have her, and how she would never grow up and never leave home, she said, like a child, "We thought of going down to the beach to watch the waves." Instantly, for no reason at all, Mrs. Ramsay became like a girl of 20, full of gaiety. A mood of revelry suddenly took possession of her. Of course they must go, of course they must go, she cried, laughing. And, running down the last 3 or 4 steps quickly, she began turning from one to the other, and laughing, and drawing Minta's wrap round her, and saying she only wished she could come too, and would they be very late, and had any of them got a watch? "Yes, Paul has," said Minta. Paul slipped a beautiful gold watch out of a little wash-leather case to show her. And as he held it in the palm of his hand before her, he felt, "She knows all about it. I need not say anything." He was saying to her, as he showed her the watch, "I've done it, Mrs. Ramsay. I owe it all to you." And seeing the gold watch lying in his hand, Mrs. Ramsay felt, how extraordinarily lucky Minta is. She is marrying a man who has a gold watch in a wash-leather bag. "How I wish I could come with you!" she cried. But she was withheld by something so strong that she never even thought of asking herself what it was. Of course it was impossible for her to go with them. But she would have liked to go, had it not been for the other thing, and tickled by the absurdity of her thought, how lucky to marry a man with a wash-leather bag for his watch, she went with a smile on her lips into the other room, where her husband sat reading. Chapter 19. Of course, she said to herself, coming into the room, she had to come here to get something she wanted. First, she wanted to sit down in a particular chair under a particular lamp. But she wanted something more, though she did not know, could not think what it was that she wanted. She looked at her husband, taking up her stocking and beginning to knit, and saw that he did not want to be interrupted, that was clear. He was reading something that moved him very much. He was half smiling, and then she knew he was controlling his emotion, He was tossing the pages over. He was acting it. Perhaps he was thinking himself the person in the book. She wondered what book it was. Oh, it was one of old Sir Walter's, she saw, adjusting the shade of her lamp so that the light fell on her knitting. For Charles Tansley had been saying— she looked up as if she expected to hear the crash of books on the floor above—had been saying that people don't read Scott any more. Then her husband thought, that's what they'll say of me. So he went and got one of those books. And if he came to the conclusion, that's true, what Charles Tansley said, he would accept it about Scott. She could see that he was weighing, considering, putting this with that as he read. But not about himself. He was always uneasy about himself. That troubled her. He would always be worrying about his own books. Will they be read? Are they good? Why aren't they better? What do people think of me? Not liking to think of him so, and wondering if they had guessed at dinner why he suddenly became irritable when they talked about fame and books lasting, wondering if the children were laughing at that, she twitched the stockings out, and all the fine gravings came drawn with steel instruments about her lips and forehead, and she grew still like a tree which has been tossing and quivering, and now, when the breeze falls, settles, leaf by leaf, into quiet. It didn't matter, any of it, she thought. A great man, a great book, fame, who could tell? She knew nothing about it. But it was his way with him, his truthfulness. For instance, at dinner she had been thinking quite instinctively, if only he would speak. She had complete trust in him. And, dismissing all this, as one passes in diving, now a weed, now a straw, now a bubble, she felt again, sinking deeper, as she had felt in the hall when the others were talking. There is something I want, something I have come to get. And she fell deeper and deeper without knowing quite what it was, with her eyes closed. And she waited a little, knitting, wondering, and slowly rose those words they had said at dinner, "The China rose is all abloom and buzzing with the honey bee," began washing from side to side of her mind rhythmically, and as they washed, words, like little shaded lights, one red, one blue, one yellow, lit up in the dark of her mind, and seemed leaving their perches up there to fly across and across, or to cry out and to be echoed. So she turned and felt on the table beside her for a book. "And all the lives we ever lived, and all the lives to be, are full of trees and changing leaves," she murmured, sticking her needles into the stocking. And she opened the book and began reading here and there at random, and as she did so, she felt that she was climbing backwards, upwards, shoving her way up under petals that curved over her, so that she only knew this is white or this is red. She did not know at first what the words meant at all. "Steer, hither steer your winged pines, all beaten mariners," she read, and turned the page, swinging herself, zigzagging this way and that, from one line to another, as from one branch to another, from one red and white flower to another, until a little sound roused her, her husband slapping his thighs. Their eyes met for a second, but they did not want to speak to each other. They had nothing to say, but something seemed, nevertheless, to go from him to her. It was the life, it was the power of it, it was the tremendous humour, she knew, that made him slap his thighs. "Don't interrupt me," he seemed to be saying. "Don't say anything. Just sit there." And he went on reading. His lips twitched. It filled him. It fortified him. He clean forgot all the little rubs and digs of the evening, and how it bored him unutterably to sit still while people ate and drank interminably, and his being so irritable with his wife, and so touchy, and minding when they passed his books over as if they didn't exist at all. But now, he felt, it didn't matter a damn who reached Z, if thought ran like an alphabet from A to Z. Somebody would reach it, if not he, then another. This man's strength and sanity, his feeling for straightforward, simple things, these fishermen, the poor old crazed creature in Mucklebacket's cottage made him feel so vigorous, so relieved of something that he felt roused and triumphant and could not choke back his tears. Raising the book a little to hide his face, he let them fall, and shook his head from side to side, and forgot himself completely. But not one or two reflections about morality and French novels and English novels, and Scott's hands being tied, but his own view perhaps being as true as the other view. Forgot his own bothers and failures completely in poor Steenie's drowning, and Mucklebacket's sorrow. That was Scott at his best. And the astonishing delight and feeling of vigour that it gave him. Well, let them improve upon that, he thought, as he finished the chapter. He felt that he had been arguing with somebody and had got the better of him. They could not improve upon that, whatever they might say, and his own position became more secure. The lovers were fiddlesticks, he thought, collecting it all in his mind again. That's fiddlesticks, that's first-rate, he thought, putting one thing beside another. But he must read it again. He could not remember the whole shape of the thing. He had to keep his judgment in suspense. So he returned to the other thought. If young men did not care for this, naturally they did not care for him either. One ought not to complain, thought Mr. Ramsay, trying to stifle his desire to complain to his wife that young men did not admire him. But he was determined he would not bother her again. Here he looked at her reading. She looked very peaceful reading. He liked to think that everyone had taken themselves off and that he and she were alone. The whole of life did not consist in going to bed with a woman, he thought, returning to Scott and Balzac, to the English novel and the French novel. Mrs. Ramsay raised her head, and like a person in a light sleep, seemed to say that if he wanted her to wake she would, she really would, but otherwise might she go on sleeping just a little longer, just a little longer. She was climbing up those branches, this way and that, laying hands on one flower and then another. Nor praise the deep vermilion in the rose, she read, and so reading she was ascending, she felt, on to the top, on to the summit. How satisfying, how restful. All the odds and ends of the day stuck to this magnet, her mind felt swept, felt clean. And then there it was, suddenly entire. She held it in her hands, beautiful and reasonable, clear and complete. Here, the sonnet. But she was becoming conscious of her husband looking at her. He was smiling at her, quizzically, as if he were ridiculing her gently for being asleep in broad daylight. But at the same time he was thinking, go on reading. You don't look sad now, he thought. And he wondered what she was reading, and exaggerated her ignorance, her simplicity, for he liked to think that she was not clever, not book-learned at all. He wondered if she understood what she was reading. Probably not, he thought. She was astonishingly beautiful. Her beauty seemed to him, if that were possible, to increase. Yet seemed it winter still and you away, as with your shadow I with these did play, she finished. Well? She said, echoing his smile dreamily, looking up from her book. As with your shadow I with these did play, she murmured, putting the book on the table. What had happened, she wondered, as she took up her knitting, since she had seen him alone? She remembered dressing and seeing the moon, Andrew holding his plate too high at dinner, being depressed by something William had said. The birds in the trees, the sofa on the landing, the children being awake, Charles Tansley waking them with his books falling. Oh, no, that she had invented. And Paul having a wash-leather case for his watch. Which should he tell him about? They're engaged, she said, beginning to knit. Paul and Minta. So I guessed, he said. There was nothing very much to be said about it. Her mind was still going up and down with the poetry. He was still feeling very vigorous, very forthright, after reading about Steenie's funeral. So they sat silent. Then she became aware that she wanted him to say something. Anything, anything, she thought, going on with her knitting. Anything will do. How nice it would be to marry a man with a wash-leather bag for his watch, she said, for that was the sort of joke they had together. He snorted. He felt about this engagement as he always felt about any engagement. The girl is much too good for that young man. Slowly it came into her head. Why is it then that one wants people to marry? What was the value, the meaning of things? Every word they said now would be true. Do say something, she thought, wishing only to hear his voice. For the shadow, the thing folding them in, was beginning, she felt, to close round her again. Say anything, she begged, looking at him, as if for help. He was silent, swinging the compass on his watch-chain to and fro, and thinking of Scott's novels and Balzac's novels. But through the crepuscular walls of their intimacy, for they were drawing together involuntarily, coming side by side, quite close, she could feel his mind like a raised hand shadowing her mind, and he was beginning, now that her thoughts took a turn he disliked, towards this pessimism, as he called it, to fidget, though he said nothing, raising his hand to his forehead, twisting a lock of hair, letting it fall again. "You won't finish that stocking tonight," he said, pointing to her stocking. That was what she wanted, the asperity in his voice reproving her. If he says it's wrong to be pessimistic, probably it is wrong, she thought. The marriage will turn out all right. "No," she said, flattening the stocking out upon her knee. "I shan't finish it." And what then? For she felt that he was still looking at her, but that his look had changed. He wanted something, wanted the thing she always found it so difficult to give him, wanted her to tell him that she loved him. And that, no, she could not do. He found talking so much easier than she did. He could say things, she never could. So naturally it was always he that said the things, and then for some reason he would mind this suddenly, and would reproach her. A heartless woman, he called her. She never told him that she loved him. But it was not so, it was not so. It was only that she could never say what she felt. Was there no crumb on his coat, nothing she could do for him? Getting up, she stood at the window with the reddish-brown stocking in her hands, partly to turn away from him, partly because she remembered how beautiful it often is, the sea at night. But she knew that he had turned his head as she turned. He was watching her. She knew that he was thinking, "You are more beautiful than ever." And she felt herself very beautiful. "Will you not tell me just for once that you love me?" He was thinking that, for he was roused, what with Minter and his book, and their having quarrelled about going to the lighthouse. But she could not do it. She could not say it. Then, knowing that he was watching her, instead of saying anything, she turned, holding her stocking, and looked at him. And as she looked at him, she began to smile, for though she had not said a word, he knew, of course he knew, that she loved him. He could not deny it. And smiling, she looked out of the window, and said, thinking to herself, nothing on earth can equal this happiness, "Yes, you were right. It's going to be wet tomorrow. You won't be able to go." And she looked at him smiling. For she had triumphed again. She had not said it, yet he knew. Chapter 1. "Well, we must wait for the future to show," said Mr. Banks, coming in from the terrace. "It's almost too dark to see," said Andrew, coming up from the beach. "One can hardly tell which is the sea and which is the land," said Prue. "Do we leave that light burning?" said Lily, as they took their coats off indoors. "No," said Prue, "not if everyone's in." "Andrew," she called back, "just put out the light in the hall." One by one the lamps were all extinguished, except that Mr. Carmichael, who liked to lie awake a little reading Virgil, kept his candle burning rather longer than the rest. Chapter 2. So with the lamps all put out, the moon sunk, and a thin rain drumming on the roof, a downpouring of immense darkness began. Nothing, it seemed, could survive the flood, the profusion of darkness, which, creeping in at keyholes and crevices, stole round window blinds, came into bedrooms, swallowed up here a jug and basin, there a bowl of red and yellow dahlias, there the sharp edges and firm bulk of a chest of drawers. Not only was furniture confounded, there was scarcely anything left of body or mind by which one could say, "This is he," or "This is she." Sometimes a hand was raised as if to clutch something or ward something off, or somebody groaned, or somebody laughed aloud as if sharing a joke with nothingness. Nothing stirred in the drawing-room, or in the dining-room, or on the staircase. Only through the rusty hinges and swollen sea-moistened woodwork certain airs, detached from the body of the wind—the house was ramshackle after all—crept round corners and ventured indoors. Almost one might imagine them, as they entered the drawing-room, questioning and wondering, toying with the flap of hanging wallpaper, asking, would it hang much longer? When would it fall? Then, smoothly brushing the walls, they passed on musingly, as if asking the red and yellow roses on the wallpaper whether they would fade, and questioning, gently, for there was time at their disposal, the torn letters in the waste-paper basket, the flowers, the books, all of which were now open to them, and asking, were they allies? Were they enemies? How long would they endure? So some random light directing them with its pale footfall upon stair and mat from some uncovered star or wandering ship, or the lighthouse even, with its pale footfall upon stair and mat, the little airs mounted the staircase and nosed round bedroom doors. But here, surely, they must cease. Whatever else may perish and disappear, what lies here is steadfast. Here one might say to those sliding lights, those fumbling airs that breathe and bend over the bed itself, here you can neither touch nor destroy. Upon which, wearily, ghostlily, as if they had feather-light fingers and the light persistency of feathers, they would look once on the shut eyes and the loosely clasping fingers, and fold their garments wearily and disappear. And so, nosing, rubbing, they went to the window on the staircase, to the servants' bedrooms, to the boxes in the attics, descending, blanched the apples on the dining-room table, fumbled the petals of roses, tried the picture on the easel, brushed the mat and blew a little sand along the floor. At length, desisting, all ceased together, gathered together, all sighed together, all together gave off an aimless gust of lamentation to which some door in the kitchen replied, swung wide, admitted nothing, and slammed to. Here Mr. Carmichael, who was reading Virgil, blew out his candle. It was past midnight. Chapter 3. But what, after all, is one night? A short space, especially when the darkness dims so soon, and so soon a bird sings, a cock crows, or a faint green quickens, like a turning leaf, in the hollow of the wave. Night, however, succeeds to night. The winter holds a pack of them in store, and deals them equally, evenly, with indefatigable fingers. They lengthen, they darken. Some of them hold aloft clear planets, plates of brightness. The autumn trees, ravaged as they are, take on the flash of tattered flags kindling in the gloom of cool cathedral caves, where gold letters on marble pages describe death in battle, and how bones bleach and burn far away in Indian sands. The autumn trees gleam in the yellow moonlight, in the light of harvest moons, the light which mellows the energy of labour, and smooths the stubble, and brings the wave-lapping blue to the shore. It seemed now as if, touched by human penitence and all its toil, Divine goodness had parted the curtain and displayed behind it, single, distinct, the hair erect, the wave falling, the boat rocking, which, did we deserve them, should be ours always. But alas, divine goodness, twitching the cord, draws the curtain. It does not please him. He covers his treasures in a drench of hail, and so breaks them, so confuses them, that it seems impossible that their calm should ever return, or that we should ever compose from their fragments a perfect whole, or read in the littered pieces the clear words of truth. For our penitence deserves a glimpse only, our toil respite only. The nights now are full of wind and destruction. The trees plunge and bend, and their leaves fly helter-skelter until the lawn is plastered with them, and they lie packed in gutters and choke drain-pipes and scatter damp paths. Also the sea tosses itself and breaks itself, and should any sleeper fancying that he might find on the beach an answer to his doubts, a sharer of his solitude, throw off his bedclothes and go down by himself to walk on the sand, no image with semblance of serving and divine promptitude comes readily to hand, bringing the night to order and making the world reflect the compass of the soul. The hand dwindles in his hand, the voice bellows in his ear. Almost it would appear that it is useless in such confusion to ask the night those questions as to what, and why, and wherefore, which tempt the sleeper from his bed to seek an answer. Mr. Ramsay, stumbling along a passage one dark morning, stretched his arms out, but Mrs. Ramsay having died rather suddenly the night before, his arms, though stretched out, remained empty. Chapter 4. So with the house empty, and the doors locked, and the mattresses rolled round, those stray heirs, advance guards of great armies, blustered in, brushed bare boards, nibbled and fanned, met nothing in bedroom or drawing-room that wholly resisted them, but only hangings that flapped, wood that creaked, the bare legs of tables, saucepans and china already furred, tarnished, cracked. What people had shed and left, a pair of shoes, a shooting cap, some faded skirts and coats in wardrobes, those alone kept the human shape, and in the emptiness indicated how once they were filled and animated, how once hands were busy with hooks and buttons, how once the looking-glass had held a face, had held a world hollowed out in which a figure turned, a hand flashed, the door opened, in came children rushing and tumbling, and went out again. Now, day after day, light turned, like a flower reflected in water, its sharp image on the wall opposite. Only the shadows of the trees, flourishing in the wind, made obeisance on the wall, and for a moment darkened the pool in which light reflected itself, or birds, flying, made a soft spot flutter slowly across the bedroom floor. So loveliness reigned, and stillness, and together made the shape of loveliness itself, a form from which life had parted, solitary like a pool at evening, far distant, seen from a train window, vanishing so quickly that the pool, pale in the evening, is scarcely robbed of its solitude, though once seen. Loveliness and stillness clasped hands in the bedroom, and among the shrouded jugs and sheeted chairs, even the prying of the wind and the soft nose of the clammy sea airs, rubbing, sniffing, iterating and reiterating their questions, "Will you fade? Will you perish?" scarcely disturbed the peace, the indifference, the air of pure integrity, as if the question they asked scarcely needed that they should answer, "We remain." Nothing, it seemed, could break that image, corrupt that innocence, or disturb the swaying mantle of silence, which, week after week, in the empty room, wove into itself the falling cries of birds, ships hooting, the drone and hum of the fields, a dog's bark, a man's shout, and folded them round the house in silence. Once only a board sprang on the landing. Once in the middle of the night with a roar, with a rupture, as after centuries of quiescence, A rock rends itself from the mountain and hurtles crashing into the valley. One fold of the shawl loosened and swung to and fro. Then again peace descended, and the shadow wavered, light bent to its own image in adoration on the bedroom wall, and Mrs. Macnab, tearing the veil of silence with hands that had stood in the wash-tub, grinding it with boots that had crunched the shingle, came as directed to open all windows and dust the bedrooms. Chapter 5. As she lurched, for she rolled like a ship at sea, and leered, for her eyes fell on nothing directly, but with a sidelong glance that deprecated the scorn and anger of the world, she was witless, she knew it. As she clutched the banisters and hauled herself upstairs and rolled from room to room, she sang. Rubbing the glass of the long looking-glass and leering sideways at her swinging figure, a sound issued from her lips, something that had been gay 20 years before on the stage perhaps, had been hummed and danced to, but now, coming from the toothless, bonneted, caretaking woman, was robbed of meaning, was like the voice of witlessness, humour, persistency itself, trodden down but springing up again, so that as she lurched, dusting, wiping, she seemed to say how it was one long sorrow and trouble, how it was getting up and going to bed again, and bringing things out and putting them away again. It was not easy or snug, this world she had known for close on 70 years. Bowed down she was with weariness. How long, she asked, creaking and groaning on her knees under the bed, dusting the boards, how long shall it endure? But hobbled to her feet again, pulled herself up, and again with her sidelong leer which slipped and turned aside even from her own face and her own sorrows, stood and gaped in the glass, aimlessly smiling, and began again the old amble and hobble, taking up mats, putting down china, looking sideways in the glass, as if, after all, she had her consolations, as if indeed there twined about her dirge some incorrigible hope. Visions of joy there must have been at the wash-tub, say with her children, yet 2 had been base-born and 1 had deserted her. At the public house, drinking, turning over scraps in her drawers. Some cleavage of the dark there must have been, some channel in the depths of obscurity, through which light enough issued to twist her face grinning in the glass and make her, turning to her job again, mumble out the old music-hall song. The mystic, the visionary, walking the beach on a fine night, stirring a puddle, looking at a stone, asking themselves, "What am I? What is this?" had suddenly an answer vouchsafed them. They could not say what it was, so that they were warm in the frost and had comfort in the desert. But Mrs. Macnab continued to drink and gossip as before. Chapter 6. The spring, without a leaf to toss, bare and bright like a virgin fierce in her chastity, scornful in her purity, was laid out on fields wide-eyed and watchful, and entirely careless of what was done or thought by the beholders. Prue Ramsay, leaning on her father's arm, was given in marriage. What, people said, could have been more fitting? And, they added, how beautiful she looked. As summer neared, as the evenings lengthened, there came to the wakeful, the hopeful, walking the beach, stirring the pool, imaginations of the strangest kind, of flesh turned to atoms which drove before the wind, of stars flashing in their hearts, of cliff, sea, cloud, and sky, brought purposely together to assemble outwardly the scattered parts of the vision within. In those mirrors the minds of men, in those pools of uneasy water, in which clouds forever turn and shadows form, dreams persisted, and it was impossible to resist the strange intimation which every gull, flower, tree, man and woman, and the white earth itself seemed to declare, but if questioned at once to withdraw, that good triumphs, happiness prevails, order rules. Or to resist the extraordinary stimulus to range hither and thither in search of some absolute good, some crystal of intensity, remote from the known pleasures and familiar virtues, something alien to the processes of domestic life, single, hard, bright, like a diamond in the sand, which would render the possessor secure. Moreover, softened and acquiescent, the spring with her bees humming and gnats dancing, threw her cloak about her, veiled her eyes, averted her head, and among passing shadows and flights of small rain seemed to have taken upon her a knowledge of the sorrows of mankind. Prue Ramsay died that summer in some illness connected with childbirth, which was indeed a tragedy, people said. Everything, they said, had promised so well. And now, in the heat of summer, the wind sent its spies about the house again. Flies wove a web in the sunny rooms. Weeds that had grown close to the glass in the night tapped methodically at the window-pane. When darkness fell, the stroke of the lighthouse, which had laid itself with such authority upon the carpet in the darkness, tracing its pattern, came now in the softer light of spring, mixed with moonlight, gliding gently, as if it laid its caress and lingered stealthily, and looked and came lovingly again. But in the very lull of this loving caress, as the long stroke leant upon the bed, the rock was rent asunder, another fold of the shawl loosened, there it hung and swayed. Through the short summer nights and the long summer days, when the empty rooms seemed to murmur with the echoes of the fields and the hum of flies, the long streamer waved gently, swayed aimlessly, while the sun so striped and barred the rooms and filled them with yellow haze that Mrs. McNab, when she broke in and lurched about, dusting, sweeping, looked like a tropical fish oaring its way through sun-lanced waters. But slumber and sleep though it might, there came later in the summer ominous sounds like the measured blows of hammers dulled on felt, which, with their repeated shocks, still further loosened the shawl and cracked the teacups. Now and again some glass tinkled in the cupboard, as if a giant voice had shrieked so loud in its agony that tumblers stood inside a cupboard vibrated too. Then again silence fell, and then, night after night, and sometimes in plain midday when the roses were bright and light turned on the wall, its shape clearly there seemed to drop into this silence, this indifference, this integrity, the thud of something falling. A shell exploded. 20 or 30 young men were blown up in France, among them Andrew Ramsay, whose death, mercifully, was instantaneous. At that season, those who had gone down to pace the beach, and ask of the sea and sky what message they reported, or what vision they affirmed, had to consider among the usual tokens of divine bounty, the sunset on the sea, the pallor of dawn, the moon rising, fishing boats against the moon, and children making mud pies or pelting each other with handfuls of grass. Something out of harmony with this jocundity and this serenity. There was the silent apparition of an ashen-coloured ship, for instance, come, gone. There was a purplish stain upon the bland surface of the sea, as if something had boiled and bled invisibly beneath. This intrusion into a scene calculated to stir the most sublime reflections and lead to the most comfortable conclusions stayed their pacing. It was difficult blandly to overlook them, to abolish their significance in the landscape, to continue, as one walked by the sea, to marvel how beauty outside mirrored beauty within. Did nature supplement what man advanced? Did she complete what he began? With equal complacence she saw his misery, his meanness, and his torture. That dream of sharing, completing, of finding in solitude on the beach an answer, was then but a reflection in a mirror, and the mirror itself was but the surface glassiness which forms in quiescence when the nobler powers sleep beneath. Impatient, despairing yet loath to go, for beauty offers her lures, has her consolations. To pace the beach was impossible. Contemplation was unendurable. The mirror was broken. Mr. Carmichael brought out a volume of poems that spring, which had an unexpected success. The war, people said, had revived their interest in poetry. Chapter 7. Night after night, summer and winter, the torment of storms, the arrow-like stillness of fine, had there been anyone to listen, from the upper rooms of the empty house only gigantic chaos streaked with lightning could have been heard tumbling and tossing as the winds and waves disported themselves like the amorphous bulks of leviathans, whose brows are pierced by no light of reason, and mounted one on top of another, and lunged and plunged in the darkness or the daylight, for night and day, month and year ran shapelessly together, in idiot games, until it seemed as if the universe were battling and tumbling in brute confusion and wanton lust aimlessly by itself. In spring the garden urns, casually filled with wind-blown plants, were gay as ever. Violets came and daffodils, but the stillness and the brightness of the day were as strange as the chaos and tumult of night, with the trees standing there, and the flowers standing there, looking before them, looking up, yet beholding nothing, eyeless and so terrible. Chapter 8. Thinking no harm, for the family would not come, never again, some said, and the house would be sold at Michaelmas, perhaps, Mrs. McNab stooped and picked a bunch of flowers to take home with her. She laid them on the table while she dusted. She was fond of flowers. It was a pity to let them waste. Suppose the house was sold. She stood, arms akimbo, in front of the looking-glass. It would want seeing to, it would. There it had stood all these years without a soul in it. The books and things were mouldy, for, what with the war and help being hard to get, the house had not been cleaned as she could have wished. It was beyond one person's strength to get it straight now. She was too old. Her legs pained her. All those books needed to be laid out on the grass in the sun. There was plaster fallen in the hall. The rain-pipe had blocked over the study window and let the water in. The carpet was ruined quite. But people should come themselves. They should have sent somebody down to see. For there were clothes in the cupboards. They had left clothes in all the bedrooms. What was she to do with them? They had the moth in them, Mrs. Ramsay's things. Poor lady. She would never want them again. She was dead, they said, years ago, in London. There was the old grey cloak she wore gardening. Mrs. McNab fingered it. She could see her, as she came up the drive with the washing, stooping over her flowers. The garden was a pitiful sight now, all run to riot, and rabbits scuttling at you out of the beds. She could see her with one of the children by her in that grey cloak. There were boots and shoes, and a brush and comb left on the dressing-table, for all the world as if she expected to come back tomorrow. She had died very sudden at the end, they said. And once they had been coming, but had put off coming, what with the war and travel being so difficult these days. They had never come all these years, just sent her money, but never wrote, never came, and expected to find things as they had left them. Ah, dear! Why, the dressing-table drawers were full of things. She pulled them open. Handkerchiefs, bits of ribbon. Yes, she could see Mrs. Ramsay as she came up the drive with the washing. "Good evening, Mrs. McNab," she would say. She had a pleasant way with her. The girls all liked her. But dear, many things had changed since then. She shut the drawer. Many families had lost their dearest. So she was dead, and Mr. Andrew killed, and Miss Prue dead too, they said, with her first baby. But everyone had lost someone these years. Prices had gone up shamefully, and didn't come down again neither. She could well remember her in her grey cloak. "Good evening, Mrs. McNab," she said, and told cook to keep a plate of milk soup for her. Quite thought she wanted it, carrying that heavy basket all the way up from town. She could see her now, stooping over her flowers, and faint and flickering, like a yellow beam or the circle at the end of a telescope, a lady in a grey cloak, stooping over her flowers, went wandering over the bedroom wall, up the dressing-table, across the washstand, as Mrs. McNab hobbled and ambled, dusting, straightening. And cook's name now, Mildred, Marion, some name like that. Ah, she had forgotten. She did forget things. Fiery, like all red-haired women. Many a laugh they had had. She was always welcome in the kitchen. She made them laugh, she did. Things were better than now. She sighed. There was too much work for one woman. She wagged her head this side and that. This had been the nursery. Why, it was all damp in here. The plaster was falling. Whatever did they want to hang a beast's skull there? Gone mouldy too. And rats in all the attics. The rain came in. But they never sent, never came. Some of the locks had gone, so the doors banged. She didn't like to be up here at dusk alone, neither. It was too much for one woman. Too much, too much. She creaked. She moaned. She banged the door. She turned the key in the lock and left the house alone, shut up, locked. Chapter 9. The house was left. The house was deserted. It was left like a shell on a sandhill to fill with dry salt grains now that life had left it. The long night seemed to have set in, the trifling airs nibbling, the clammy breaths fumbling, seemed to have triumphed. The saucepan had rusted and the mat decayed. Toads had nosed their way in. Idly, aimlessly, the swaying shawl swung to and fro. A thistle thrust itself between the tiles in the larder. The swallows nested in the drawing-room. The floor was strewn with straw. The plaster fell in shovelfuls. Rafters were laid bare. Rats carried off this and that to gnaw behind the wainscots. Tortoise-shell butterflies burst from the chrysalis and pattered their life out on the window-pane. Poppies sowed themselves among the dahlias. The lawn waved with long grass. Giant artichokes towered among roses. A fringed carnation flowered among the cabbages, while the gentle tapping of a weed at the window had become, on winter's nights, a drumming from sturdy trees and thorned briars which made the whole room green in summer. What power could now prevent the fertility, the insensibility of nature? Mrs. McNab's dream of a lady, of a child, of a plate of milk soup. It had wavered over the walls like a spot of sunlight and vanished. She had locked the door. She had gone. It was beyond the strength of one woman, she said. They never sent. They never wrote. There were things up there rotting in the drawers. It was a shame to leave them so, she said. The place was gone to rack and ruin. Only the lighthouse beam entered the rooms for a moment, sent its sudden stare over bed and wall in the darkness of winter, looked with equanimity at the thistle and the swallow, the rat and the straw. Nothing now withstood them, nothing said no to them. Let the wind blow, let the poppy seed itself and the carnation mate with the cabbage, let the swallow build in the drawing-room, and the thistle thrust aside the tiles, and the butterfly sun itself on the faded chintz of the armchairs. Let the broken glass and the china lie out on the lawn and be tangled over with grass and wild berries. For now had come that moment, that hesitation when dawn trembles and night pauses, when, if a feather alight in the scale, it will be weighed down. One feather, and the house, sinking, falling, would have turned and pitched downwards to the depths of darkness. In the ruined room picnickers would have lit their kettles, lovers sought shelter there, lying on the bare boards, and the shepherd stored his dinner on the bricks, and the tramp slept with his coat round him to ward off the cold. Then the roof would have fallen, briars and hemlocks would have blotted out path, step, and window, would have grown unequally but lustily over the mound, until some trespasser, losing his way, could have told only by a red-hot poker among the nettles, or a scrap of china in the hemlock, that here once someone had lived, there had been a house. If the feather had fallen, if it had tipped the scale downwards, the whole house would have plunged to the depths to lie upon the sands of oblivion. But there was a force working, something not highly conscious, something that leered, something that lurched, something not inspired to go about its work with dignified ritual or solemn chanting. Mrs. McNab groaned. Mrs. Bast creaked. They were old, they were stiff, their legs ached. They came with their brooms and pails at last. They got to work. All of a sudden, would Mrs. McNab see that the house was ready, one of the young ladies wrote. Would she get this done? Would she get that done? All in a hurry. They might be coming for the summer, had left everything to the last, expected to find things as they had left them. Slowly and painfully, with broom and pail, mopping, scouring, Mrs. McNab, Mrs. Bast, stayed the corruption and the rot, rescued from the pool of time that was fast closing over them, now a basin, now a cupboard, fetched up from oblivion all the Waverley novels and a tea-set one morning, in the afternoon restored to sun and air a brass fender and a set of steel fire-irons. George, Mrs. Bast's son, caught the rats and cut the grass. They had the builders. Attended with the creaking of hinges and the screeching of bolts, the slamming and banging of damp-swollen woodwork, some rusty, laborious birth seemed to be taking place, as the women, stooping, rising, groaning, singing, slapped and slammed, upstairs now down in the cellars. Oh, they said, the work. They drank their tea in the bedroom sometimes, or in the study, breaking off work at midday with the smudge on their faces and their old hands clasped and cramped with the broom handles. Flopped on chairs, they contemplated, now the magnificent conquest over taps and bath, now the more arduous, more partial triumph over long rows of books, black as ravens once, now white-stained, breeding pale mushrooms and secreting furtive spiders. Once more, as she felt the tea warm in her, the telescope fitted itself to Mrs. McNab's eyes, and in a ring of light she saw the old gentleman, lean as a rake, wagging his head, as she came up with the washing. Talking to himself, she supposed, on the lawn. He never noticed her. Some said he was dead, some said she was dead. Which was it? Mrs. Bast didn't know for certain either. The young gentleman was dead. That she was sure. She had read his name in the papers. There was the cook now, Mildred, Marion, some such name as that, a red-headed woman, quick-tempered like all her sort, but kind too, if you knew the way with her. Many a laugh they had had together. She saved a plate of soup for Maggie, a bite of ham sometimes, whatever was over. They lived well in those days. They had everything they wanted. Glibly, jovially, with the tea hot in her, she unwound her ball of memories, sitting in the wicker armchair by the nursery fender. There was always plenty doing, people in the house, 20 staying sometimes, and washing up till long past midnight. Mrs. Bast, she had never known them, had lived in Glasgow at that time, wondered, putting her cup down, whatever they hung that beast's skull there for, shot in foreign parts, no doubt. It might well be, said Mrs. McNab, wantoning on with her memories. They had friends in eastern countries, gentlemen staying there, ladies in evening dress. She had seen them once through the dining-room door, all sitting at dinner. 20, she dared say, all in their jewellery, and she asked to stay help wash up, might be till after midnight. Ah, said Mrs. Bast, they'd find it changed. She leant out of the window. She watched her son George scything the grass. They might well ask what had been done to it, seeing how old Kennedy was supposed to have charge of it, and then his leg got so bad after he fell from the cart, and then perhaps no one for a year, or the better part of one, and then Davy MacDonald, and seeds might be sent, but who should say if they were ever planted? They'd find it changed. She watched her son scything. He was a great one for work, one of those quiet ones. Well, They must be getting along with the cupboards, she supposed. They hauled themselves up. At last, after days of labour within, of cutting and digging without, dusters were flicked from the windows were shut too, keys were turned all over the house, the front door was banged. It was finished. And now, as if the cleaning and the scrubbing and the scything and the mowing had drowned it, there rose that half-heard melody, that intermittent music which the ear half catches but lets fall, a bark, a bleat, irregular, intermittent yet somehow related, the hum of an insect, the tremor of cut grass, dissevered yet somehow belonging, the jar of a door-beetle, the squeak of a wheel, loud, low but mysteriously related, which the ear strains to bring together and is always on the verge of harmonizing, but they are never quite heard, never fully harmonized, and at last, in the evening, one after another the sounds die out, and the harmony falters and silence falls. With the sunset, sharpness was lost, and, like mist rising, quiet rose, quiet spread, the wind settled. Loosely the world shook itself down to sleep. Darkly here, without a light to it, save what came green suffused through leaves, or pale on the white flowers in the bed by the window. Lily Briscoe had her bag carried up to the house late one evening in September. Mr. Carmichael came by the same train. Chapter 10. Then, indeed, peace had come. Messages of peace breathed from the sea to the shore. Never to break its sleep any more, to lull it rather more deeply to rest, and whatever the dreamers dreamt holily, dreamt wisely, to confirm, what else was it murmuring, as Lily Briscoe laid her head on the pillow in the clean still room and heard the sea. Through the open window the voice of the beauty of the world came murmuring, too softly to hear exactly what it said, but what mattered if the meaning were plain, entreating the sleepers— the house was full again, Mrs. Beckwith was staying there, also Mr. Carmichael— if they would not actually come down to the beach itself, at least to lift the blind and look out. They would see then Night flowing down in purple, his head crowned, his sceptre jewelled, and how in his eyes a child might look. And if they still faltered— Lily was tired out with travelling, and slept almost at once, but Mr. Carmichael read a book by candlelight— if they still said no, that it was vapour, this splendour of his, and that the dew had more power than he, and they preferred sleeping, gently then, without complaint or argument, the voice would sing its song. Gently the waves would break— Lily heard them in her sleep. Tenderly the light fell— it seemed to come through her eyelids. And it all looked, Mr. Carmichael thought, shutting his book, falling asleep, much as it used to look. Indeed, the voice might resume, as the curtains of dark wrapped themselves over the house, over Mrs. Beckwith, Mr. Carmichael, and Lily Briscoe, so that they lay with several folds of blackness on their eyes. Why not accept this, be content with this, acquiesce and resign? The sigh of all the seas breaking in measure round the isles soothed them. The night wrapped them. Nothing broke their sleep, until, the birds beginning and the dawn weaving their thin voices into its whiteness, a cart grinding, a dog somewhere barking, the sun lifted the curtains, broke the veil on their eyes, and Lily Briscoe stirring in her sleep. She clutched at her blankets as a faller clutches at the turf on the edge of a cliff. Her eyes opened wide. Here she was again, she thought, sitting bolt upright in bed. Awake,